Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everyone's heard about them. They are like the most important archaeological discovery that's happened in so many years. And they're so important for us to understand. And we have an expert to talk about them with us today. Really excited that we have Dr. Andrew Perrin. He's a well-accomplished scholar in leadership, teaching, and research. He's an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls, author of numerous books, including this one, Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the book that we're going to be talking about today with him. We have a conversation inspired from us getting to read it and really excited for us all to learn about the Dead Sea Scrolls with him. Dr. Andrew Perrin, thank you for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me. Glad to be on the platform with you. And I think you both were one of the first to reach out to the publisher to say like, hey, here's a book. And I'm encouraged that you didn't like book the podcast the next day because you actually read the book. So that's fantastic. I already feel like we're off to a great start. There was a long enough distance in between there, but no, really happy to be here and diving into this with you.
Yeah, well, like we said, we loved reading this book. And I'll give a quick plug before I guess we dive in. You can find books in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are, top-notch academic reference material that's excellent, right? But it's just not readable. You're going to research and reference something here or there. You can also find a lot of high rhetoric, but full of nonsense stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. It might sound engaging to read, but it's just nonsense. And to me, this book is so readable, so engaging. You give real examples, and it's all rooted in scholarship. Really enjoyed reading this.
Yeah. No, glad to hear that. Glad to hear that.
So let's dive right in. I think one of the biggest topics that's come up recently. One, I should just say the Dead Sea Scrolls have made their turn in media again recently on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
And so I think it's great that we're having, an interview with you, comparing the Isaiah manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text has been fascinating and sometimes contentious topic.
For sure.
This has even made headlines and famous interview, like I said, with Joe Rogan and Wes Huff. Some people seem to get the impression that these words are the exact same, while others might say there are thousands of differences, but also not share any examples to give a sense of what these differences are. You give some interesting examples in your book. I wonder, in your assessment, how would you evaluate and communicate the similarities and differences between Isaiah and the various manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic texts?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm happy to dive in because, as you said, it's a current conversation. The scrolls kind of have their own news cycle in a way. They come back and forth and around again. But it was really, really cool to see, I think, to see that conversation between, Joe Rogan and Wes Huff, the fact that we've got ancient manuscripts on one of the most popular podcasts. Like, that's just a win. Whether you agree or disagree, I thought that was just a win for all of us in different ways.
100%.
And so there's always this intrigue about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but your specific question is one that's worth diving right into. I think when I hear conversations like that, or when my friends or folks or colleagues ask me questions like around that specific text and that topic, in some ways the question they're actually asking is, do the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the reliability of the Bible, or whatever word they might want to use there? Now, we could take the whole podcast on that question alone, I'm sure, and kind of pull it apart. What's behind it? What does it imply? What does it assume? What does it miss? I think when we look at the book of Isaiah as an example, we see many things. The opportunity of the scrolls is that they're roughly 1,000 years older than our medieval codices, like the Masoretic text and the Leningrad Codex. So already we've wound the clock back much older, which is very meaningful and does matter. They revealed many things, and some of these things on both sides of the ledger. So on the one hand, they did reveal that there's remarkable textual stability in most books of the Hebrew Bible for most of that arc, right? From the ancient world into the medieval period and further. It's pretty consistent, which is quite remarkable. So it's not to diminish that. And they revealed important differences in many of them. So how can this be? Well, there's a number of things I think we need to consider here and kind of not forget. First, the scrolls are coming from a scribal culture. I don't know about you, but I don't think we live in a scribal culture really anymore, right? We need to learn about what that world looks like. Scribes are not photocopiers. Their job was in some ways to inherit texts and traditions as well as invest in them. So we have some diversity in that world. That shouldn't shock us because scribes are doing what scribes do. They copy and they interpret at the same time. When we get to Isaiah, then we have manuscripts that have remarkable similarity to later codices and manuscripts in the Masoretic tradition, like 1Q Isaiah B. That was not the one I don't believe they talked about in the podcast, which is interesting. 1Q Isaiah B is the kind of lesser known sibling of 1Q Isaiah A, the big Isaiah scroll that we're probably all used to seeing. 1Q Isaiah B is very remarkably close to the Masoretic text. Again, without vowel pointing and all that, but letters and words and phrases and passages as close as you can get to something that's highly stable and consistent down the line. The big manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, is brilliant for many reasons. One of them is that it has so many differences. Again, the arc of the story is the same, the same structure to the book, but there are differences. So one example I pick up on in early in the book is Isaiah 41:11. I doubt many will know this passage, but it's one where we can see this kind of play out in a fairly safe space. This is not a real deal breaker of a theological verse or anything, but I'll read here in 1Q Isaiah A in translation. This says, "Look, all who are incensed at you will be disgraced and put to shame. Those who contend with you will all die." So remember that ending. They will all die. Then we go to literally the next manuscript found right nearby in 1Q Isaiah B in Cave 1. And this passage reads this way. It says, "Look, all who are incensed at you will be disgraced and put to shame. Those who contend with you will become nothing and be ashamed." Well, that's interesting. Which one is it? Is everyone going to die, or are they just going to become nothing and be ashamed? Or is that effectively saying the same thing? Is it potato? Like, these are the conversations we can have. But for me, when I see examples like that, and there are many examples like that, it really brings to mind two things. I guess these are really opportunities as far as I'm concerned, less than they are problems. And opportunity number one is, we have the chance in the last less than 80 years since we've had the scrolls to see scripture as it was in an ancient scribal context before the Bible. So to see scripture as it was is a very remarkable modern and ancient opportunity we have here. And then the second is to kind of see scripture for what it can be today by asking new or different questions about text criticism. What do we think about now materials that are maybe more consistent and more diverse than we thought? I don't think those are problems. I think these are opportunities. And, to kind of switch or to pick a metaphor, and I talk about this a bit in the book, I view this closer to artistic restoration than text criticism. You go to a museum, you go to the Louvre in Paris, you want to see the Mona Lisa. It looks stunning, looks fantastic. That's because there's been a lot of work done on it. There's been a lot of restoration that's been done on that by folks that really know that art and that era and that history. Something similar here. So I think the scrolls, if you want them to prove the Bible, okay, fine, but you're actually missing the big opportunity here. And the opportunity is to see scripture as it was and also kind of think more about what it can be. So that's kind of what gets me out of bed in the mornings, thinking about questions like that. But I just think it's so cool that people are talking about it. Whether or not you're going to agree with everything is beside the point. It's just good all around if people are diving into stuff in more public spaces.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm so glad it came up on the Joe Rogan podcast. And you're right. It's an issue where some people have very strong opinions. But at the very least, we can be better informed by looking at the actual original primary sources or from trusted people. And one of the things I love that I want to dive in briefly is I love that we use the word opportunity. Because I think for so many, the Dead Sea Scrolls is a really tense topic, right? And it's something we're trying to get in and out as quickly as possible.
I seem to have gotten stuck in that somehow.
Hey, you're still there, right?
Yeah. They didn't let me out. Wait, is there a way out of this thing?
Nobody go pull him out of the cave. Go get him out.
Yeah. One of those treasure hunting movies when everyone's trying to race out and everything starts crashing in. You're still in there.
Yeah, I'm the extra in the background that just gets crushed.
Yeah.
That's great.
But no, I really appreciate the tone of your book. It feels like, hey, let's explore. There's opportunity here. This is great. Let's have fun with this and let's learn. And I think that's a really helpful way to dive into the scrolls. So anyway, great stuff. Great.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying too about what was the Bible like before it was the Bible, right? What do we have here in scribal culture within a Second Temple world? What is happening? What's it like to read scripture in that context? That sort of comes upon this question that we have for you then. It sort of leads right into it. So tell us about the ancient commentaries that were found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have a fascinating line regarding this in your book, and I quote, so Pesher Habakkuk is a reminder that the Dead Sea Scrolls are as much about engaging with new contexts as they are encountering new texts, end quote. So you dive deeper into this, because I loved this part of the book when you really discuss this, because it shows, look, the Jews are still trying to understand these ancient texts and still writing them even during this time, in essence. So we would love for you to dig into this more.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think of the scrolls, it's really those two things. We have new texts and new contexts. Arguably, the new contexts are as or more important than the text, but that's just me, and we could kind of pull that apart if we wanted to. But what do I mean by new context? I think we know what we mean by new text. Like we just talked about the Isaiah scrolls, right? Those were new. We get that we didn't have them. They're new. Well, when we think about the context of scripture in the ancient world, we could say that, Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew scriptures at the time, like they didn't fall from the sky, right? No. Like these are inherited traditions that were preserved and passed along, and they're preserved and passed along largely in scribal communities, in with, for, and by other Jewish communities. Like it always has a setting around it. And this is not some altar call for historical criticism. This is just this is how texts work. They don't write themselves, they don't read themselves, and they don't get copied and passed around themselves. And they certainly don't interpret themselves then or now. Yeah. That's where there's something interesting for this idea of context. And for the scrolls, then, even we could ask about, well, which context? We probably have multiple. We have context in a given cave. Like Cave 7 only had Greek text in it. Like, what's going on with that? What about that context? Well, then there's a context of the Qumran community. This is an ancient Jewish scribal community, probably a part of an Essene movement or something like this. How are they reading and understanding scripture? Then we can look at many of the scrolls and go, well, is there a wider cultural context in Second Temple Judaism here that we haven't thought about? Because these scrolls, even if this Essene community is an insider community, they're highly engaged in the intellectual culture, the political culture, the social fabric of the world around them. They're talking about the Romans. They're talking against the Romans. They're angry about the priestly establishment in Jerusalem. They're dialoguing with this context. So this example of Pesher Habakkuk is a great way of seeing this in an important way. This is one, we might call this an early kind of example of what, early biblical interpretation would look like in this kind of commentary form. The Pesher texts are revolutionary because, in a way, they kind of look like Bible commentaries today. You quote a text and then you comment on it, and then you quote a text and you comment on it. It just keeps going, right? It's not the same thing, but something similar. And that's the first time we really saw this, was in the scrolls. And when you look at these texts, what are they doing? Well, they're doing what humans kind of try to do, but also in a very specific context. They're trying to make sense of this past tradition, understand the complexities of the world around them, and project where things are going in the future. To me, that's kind of what's going on in these Pesher texts. So when we look at them, they're doing that in a very specific context, to use that word again, where they understand that they're in a community context that is expecting big things on the horizon. They have a foundational understanding that the teacher of righteousness, kind of this figure in their memory that founded their community, had a special revelation of this is how we should be interpreting the scriptures and these types of things. And they're angry at the Romans. They disagree with the Jerusalem establishment, and they kind of think everybody else is wrong. And they're trying to hold all those things together. So when they come to read Habakkuk, early on in the scroll, I want to say columns 1 and 2, they kind of unpack this idea that they have this special revelation. Everyone else is wrong. And even the prophet Habakkuk didn't understand this. The meaning of his words were kind of tucked away and hidden, only to be unlocked now finally by them. Now, it's a great read. It's a beautiful scroll as well. It's a great read. I guarantee you none of us on this call are going to agree with their interpretation of Habakkuk. It's quite interesting and strange to kind of our modern minds, I think. We don't have to agree with it to appreciate what they're doing, though. And what they're trying to do is engage and extend that tradition of Habakkuk and understand the world around them, and kind of order themselves and orient the world around them to that in this new and changing context. And honestly, I think that's kind of a larger enterprise that goes over the centuries. That's kind of what, that's what traditions are doing today.
Yeah.
Faith traditions in different ways are doing that today. They're going, we have an inherited tradition. We've got a world that's complex and changing, and we have some sort of hope and expectation for the future. How do you stitch it all together? And there's better and worse ways of doing that, but I think it's really cool to observe some of that in a text like Pesher Habakkuk.
Just out of curiosity, how, and maybe you don't know enough to say, but I'd be curious, how much would you compare, contrast what's going on in Pesher Habakkuk to maybe some typological fulfillment passages in the New Testament, the way that they use some Hebrew Bible? Would you say it's very similar, different, same ballpark? How would you kind of frame that?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. I've been thinking about this a little bit. So my answer might be kind of like, here's some in process stuff rather than here's the final answer.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot of, I don't love the word parallels, but similarities in what they're doing. You think about like a passage like Isaiah 40 verse 3, right? About preparing a way in the wilderness. That's interpreted in the Gospels and in Qumran for very different reasons. But they're both writers or communities of those traditions are looking to that passage as a way of building, as a way of shaping their identity and articulating their expectations with some sort of continuity to the past. So it's interesting to see how when, writers of the Gospels, for example, I touch a little bit on the Gospels and a little bit on Paul in the book later on, but Gospels is for now. When you look at the things they're quoting most and kind of threading into their writings, it's books like Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. That's also kind of the top three at Qumran for what they're copying and commenting on as well. And to me, what that suggests is less about how do we understand New Testament use of the Old Testament. I've never found that really compelling or appealing. For me, this is going, how do we understand Christian origins? And by that, I mean early Jesus followers who were predominantly Jewish. How are they part of that larger cultural context? Then the similarities that we have to your question, Matt, shouldn't surprise us. In fact, it would be quite strange if the gospel traditions were doing something completely at every turn, drastically different. They have to make sense in that late Second Temple period context. And they're part of that world in a way as much as the Qumran community is. Again, there's a lot of nuance there, but I think there's a whole area that's been worked on, but I think is a great kind of deep end to dive into on uses of scripture and how our scribes and writers reimagining it and rewriting it and extending it as they develop new texts, be it the community rule, war scroll, or the Gospel of Mark, or even writings of Paul.
So, okay, you're kind of getting me interested now in some of the other parts of your book and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, for some people, we go to the Dead Sea Scrolls because of the biblical texts, right? Okay, now I'm done.
Yeah.
But man, there's so much here that's super cool. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, you specialize especially in the Aramaic texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Correct.
I'd be curious, why did you choose to specialize, particularly in the Aramaic texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls? And can you share maybe what are a few of these texts? Why are they so interesting?
Yeah, happy to. My journey into scrolls is very much like you described. My master's is closer to working on biblical scrolls. I still have working on that. I'm working on a project on Daniel right now, so I have my head deep in that world as well. But I did dive into Aramaic texts for a number of reasons. One of them is that we didn't have a very detailed understanding, I should say, of what Aramaic intellectual scribal culture and literature is like. We have about half of the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. We've got, a few words and phrases in Genesis and Jeremiah. We've got these, imperial dispatches, Ezra, Nehemiah, this type of thing, Ezra, I should say. But Aramaic was the dominant language of the Near East from about the 7th century on, even once, Greek, Alexander the Great, sweeps across the known world at the time. Even when Greek becomes the language of that empire, Aramaic still persists. Throwback footnote. This is why in Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, they're speaking Aramaic or trying to, right? It's because that was kind of the world of Judea. So when the scrolls were discovered, we have writings. It's predominantly in Hebrew. That was actually the surprising thing because we didn't have a lot of Hebrew literature from the period, but we didn't have a lot of Aramaic stuff. So in the scrolls, we have between 10 to 13% of the overall library is written in Aramaic. And that's a range because they're fragmentary. It depends how you count things. So that's about how much. We have our earliest materials related to the book of Daniel in Hebrew and Aramaic. Like I said, I'm working on that right now. So it's not as simple as counting manuscripts, but there are Hebrew and Aramaic stuff there. We also have examples of writings that we knew about from other collections, but didn't have their original language originals. So like the book of Tobit from the Apocrypha or Deuterocanon. We know it existed in at least 2, probably more like 3 versions in the Septuagint and multiple other traditions down through the ages. We didn't really know where it started and what language. And the scrolls seem to have confirmed here that it was written in Aramaic. We have 4 Aramaic manuscripts of Tobit at Qumran. And we have one, what I think is a Hebrew translation, 4Q200. That's interesting. So your question, why the Aramaic scrolls? Well, you get to play around now in this world of, frankly, Tobit's just a cool book. Second, Aramaic is a fun language. And what does it mean that at least one scribe was like, I'm going to translate this into Hebrew?
Yeah.
You know, I've argued that that's saying something very important because language matters. And the Aramaic of Tobit is not difficult. So it's not like the book of Job where you're wrestling through the Hebrew and you're like, this thing doesn't make any sense. In Qumran, we also have an Aramaic translation of Job. So you have this, that's like when I look at the Aramaic scrolls, you have this stuff that goes in a few different directions. But what really kind of brought me into it, my dissertation is on Aramaic texts, but primarily on dream visions in these texts. These are not all of them, like Tobit's a good example, this is not the case, but a lot of these texts, about 2/3 of these Aramaic texts have dream visions, and most of them are apocalyptic in genre or outlook. That is also, to me, very interesting because that is a genre that's kind of liminal in the Hebrew Bible, right? You could argue this in bits of Isaiah, but it's really those later parts of Daniel, which is right at the same time as all this stuff.
Yeah.
Now we have, again, to use those earlier words, now more texts and a bigger context. So when we're thinking about apocalypses in Daniel or into Revelation and wherever else you want to pull that thread, we have writings like a 4 Kingdoms text in Aramaic, in the Aramaic scrolls, that is trying to periodize history, but it's trying to update that because it seems like this, again, my read on it is coming after the book of Daniel, is trying to, in a way, update the timeline. We have a number of other texts like Enoch texts that we knew about. Some of them we didn't have Aramaic originals, and we have other things about Enoch in these traditions that are really exciting. And then we have writings like the Genesis Apocryphon, which I spent a fair bit of time on in the book. A fantastic read. It's an interpretive text, but not like the Pesher, where it's quoting and commenting. It's rewriting and retelling the story. It's almost like a remake of a movie, right? I don't know, but we're seeing this a lot in the last decade or two. There's very few new movies. A lot of them are remakes, right?
They're all remakes.
They're all remakes. So, but they're trying to extend a tradition, and they're doing that in some really unique ways. So, Genesis Apocryphon is a great text for that. So, I guess that's the long answer. But the short answer is these are just cool texts. It's a fun language, and it doesn't force you into a corner. It allows you to think about things like translation, interpretation. It has, I think, a really interesting open runway into kind of Christian origins. You're thinking about, Aramaic traditions behind the Gospels and these things. So Aramaic texts, a small slice of the pie, but to me, they really open up a lot of, cross-disciplinary conversations.
Wow.
Yeah, so cool. I wonder briefly, you said something that really piqued my interest. This will show people how nerdy I am, but everyone knows how much I love the language side of things.
Great. Let them see it again. That's good.
Let them see it again. It was interesting. I'm no Tobit expert, but I hadn't heard someone mention what you said about, you think that Dead Sea Scroll is actually a Hebrew translation of an Aramaic of Tobit. If there's any more detail you could share on that, I'd be kind of curious. What makes you think that the Hebrew scroll is a translation of the Aramaic, and what that then means? Like what might that mean culturally for what they're doing and what they see this as?
Yeah, happy to kind of pull that thread. You're really kind and generous earlier saying that how my book was very readable and an accessible tone. Yeah. I also write some dry, boring stuff, so I will footnote to some dry, boring stuff for the right audience.
You're still a true scholar, right?
Yeah, I don't want people to think I've given up on being dry and boring. But I had an article in Vetus Testamentum, which is an Old Testament Hebrew Bible Studies journal, on this a few years back. Cool. And I unpack that in a few different directions. One of them is when we think about, at least I should say but I think, when I think about language, we're often thinking about words on a page, syntax, vocabulary, a form of communication. But Hebrew in this period, like the mid-Second Temple period, has incredibly important associations with Jewish nationalism and identity. Jubilees even says it has this thing about this is the revealed language of God. There's a lot. To put something in Hebrew really meant something. Compositionally Hebrew really meant something. So that's an important thing. We're also at a point in time when we don't have a canon of scripture, but that's starting to come together in terms of authoritative writings. And many of those are, I think, we could probably make that case for many of the books that end up in the Hebrew Bible, that they're starting to grow in different ways to be authoritative. So when you have, again, at least one scribe, whether or not anybody did this or not, or believed the claim or not, if I'm correct, or maybe this was just his exercise and he wanted to try it out, who knows, right? But to have something cross the line from being a lingua franca, like the common language Aramaic, into a lingua sacra, a holy language at this point in time, I don't think that's something that would have been made lightly. And to make a scroll, I think we take for granted how much that actually matters. To put something down, to have the expertise to put something down, then to have the expertise to translate it, and then to invest the time and money. You and I can buy a pen and a piece of paper for nothing, and we can write down a grocery list, and it does not matter. Something very different in this material and Scribal culture. So the kind of the argument I made is that we should maybe be thinking about, when we are looking at how the scrolls, how we think writers of the scrolls of the Qumran communities understanding their literature as authoritative or not. I think language matters. I don't think that they're reading the Genesis Apocryphon in Aramaic as an authoritative writing. I think it mattered for different reasons, but I think the Torah mattered more. Yeah, Hebrew Torah mattered more. And there's something of a parallel here with that Tobit. Again, we don't know a final answer, but to me it was really worth asking the question.
So on that note, though, with a lingua franca and lingua sacra, would you say that Hebrew was being used just in a common language, though, amongst the Essenes at all, or amongst the Qumran community?
Yeah, I think there's a few parts to my kind of, again, we would kind of rolls around my head a bit and maybe think out loud. But one of them is when we say Aramaic versus Hebrew, and I say that, we're probably drawing a little too sharp of a divide.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
This is not like saying, Mandarin and French, where they're drastically different. Yeah. Right. But I do think it is something that we see a spike in Hebrew in and around the Hasmonean era for nationalistic reasons. I think we have, now we have at Qumran see that Hebrew was used within a community context, in a Jewish Scribal community context. I think we also know Hebrew has an increasing role to play in liturgy and things like this. So I think it's associated with certain things where Aramaic is not, would maybe be a way to put it. Having said that, I think they're closer than we realize. And Scribal culture, this is something that I think is another great book for listeners that just came out in the last year, I believe, by William Schniedewind, who really wrote the Bible, I think is the name of the title. Great book, really well written. And one of the things he talks about there a lot is, Scribal culture was largely Aramaic, and it was, Hebrew Scribal culture had to kind of grow and develop through its in that space. So those are some of the things that are maybe getting towards an answer, but it's that. Yeah. Is it a divide? Not necessarily. Does Hebrew matter in ways that I think Aramaic didn't? Yes. But I don't think it's as maybe as stark as we might think in terms of categories. Yeah.
Good.
Well, I'm going to check out that article. Appreciate you diving into that. At least for me, I'm sure there are a few listeners who are glad we did that too. But
you said you were the Bible nerd, so now I'll be watching the analytics to see if there's a download somewhere.
We'll see. We'll see if it works. I think it's cool. I've been looking into a lot of things in Deuterocanon, Apocrypha debates and whatnot recently, and this is a really interesting little scholarly piece, that this idea you have again of this lingua sacra, right, being translated into Hebrew. That makes sense. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about another interesting type of literature that is definitely there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is Pseudepigrapha.
For sure.
again, getting back to controversial, contentious subject matters, right? I'd be curious if you can just kind of talk about this, because there are people who disregard pseudepigrapha in an a priori way, like viewing the entire genre as deceptive.
Yeah.
But you say something really interesting in your book. I'm going to quote you actually from page 12. I really like this quote. You said, "Scribes of such traditions often," and here's really clever, I can't put this in my words, right? You do in little parentheses, presented, right? So scribes of such traditions represented the material in first-person voices of famous figures to show that the past continued to have a voice in the present. The technical term for this is pseudepigraphy, end quote. So in other words, this was not trickery, but reverence. It was a way of capturing voices from the past and ensuring that they continued to speak. Oh, I'm sorry, that's where your end quote is. Let's say that doesn't like my writing. That sounds a lot more like yours. But anyway, can you just expand on this idea about the role that this kind of literature played in the Second Temple Judaism period?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a whole area a whole area of writings rather that's really exciting to read. Just out of pure interest, but there's also, like you said, there's some missed opportunities or misunderstandings around it as well. Mm-hmm. So let's put those on the table. The term pseudepigrapha might be something folks are more familiar with, and that's often understood, I think, as a modern construct. It's not really a genre per se, but I think when you hear pseudepigrapha today, it kind of has a rough definition of, this is the stuff that didn't make it into the Bible, but it's still interesting and maybe relevant for, how we study ancient Judaism, Christianity, and publishers still want to sell you this stuff. That's kind of what pseudepigrapha has come to mean. We have volumes of pseudepigrapha, so there's no formal list about what pseudepigrapha would be. There's some construct that happens there in scholarly and publishing circles, and there's some precedent for this, but not very old in the use of the term. But pseudepigraphy is something we could talk about that cuts across collections in canonical categories as well. Now, when pseudepigraphy, what I mean there is this is a scribal approach or an authorial approach that we see scribes and authors extending traditions so that they are capturing and harnessing the past, perhaps or often through the first-person voice of an authoritative speaker in the past. Now, when I say that, that might be like, oh, wait, hold on, that sounds a bit fishy, like you quoted. Frankly, this is happening in the Hebrew Bible. Go read Deuteronomy. Right? This is one of the things about the scrolls is a lot of the stuff we're observing here at play is just part of how things were done in scribal cultures that shaped the Hebrew Bible in many ways, not all the time, but that's also helpful here. But when we look at the scrolls, we see this probably amplified or developed in some new ways that we weren't aware of. So a few examples, we've been talking about Hebrew and Aramaic, so maybe one on either side of the equation. There's a writing called the Temple Scroll, which is a really interesting scroll. Again, really beautiful. If you Google images of the Temple Scroll, it's a beautiful script, nice looking manuscript as well. But what this does is it's boldly, rewriting. We're talking about remakes. This is rewriting stretches of Exodus and Deuteronomy, but it's doing so in the first-person voice of God, and so it's claiming quite boldly that this is actually the written version of the revelation God gave to Moses. Kind of a bold move. But what that's doing is it's trying to capture that authority. Moses is already an authoritative figure in his voice, right? We see that, like we were saying, in Deuteronomy and other spaces. But Temple Scroll is trying to extend that tradition, have it make sense. And to do that, they're trying to harness the voice of God. So we can see that in terms of that fundamental piece of like a first-person voice speaking. We also see this in Aramaic with other mechanisms. A writing that I've worked on a fair bit is called the Visions of Amram. Now, Amram is not a famous patriarch. He doesn't have any words. He's a name. He's the Amramites. He's known by his ites in his name and a space in a genealogical tree. That's it in the Hebrew scriptures. But we have at least five manuscripts in Aramaic that we have the title even intact, and it says this is a copy of the writing of the Visions of Amram. And Amram is telling his life and times in his first-person voice, and he also has a vision in this dream, and at the end of the dream, he writes down the vision. So what the scribe is making the claim of is that this is an authority, or this is an ancestral voice still speaking based on revelation, and the text you're hearing or holding in your hand is actually that written visionary account. To us, that seems strange. because we live in a post-printing press, post-copyright world with very different laws around things like freedom of speech and things like this that don't work in the ancient world. So there's so many things like this. The pseudepigraphy was a well-developed practice, I think, in different ways in the Hebrew scriptures, and even more than that, even beyond that, in Hellenistic culture. Like this is. Yeah. So when I get at stuff like this, it's just cool to talk about, and they're fun texts to read, and what are they doing and how are they doing it. Most often, I find the areas of tension I might have or we might have with the scrolls, they're less about the scrolls and they're more about us. And that's a really cool kind of growth opportunity to go, I don't have to agree with everything, but maybe I have some things that are part of our world that don't work back then. And that's why I'm feeling these growing pains. And so you have examples like Temple Scroll, like Visions of Amram, like Deuteronomy, like Hellenistic, where this is just one of the ways that scribes are going, if that tradition mattered enough back then, we better bring it forward. And this is one of the mechanisms they do it. So as much as I'm complaining against publishers publishing Pseudepigrapha, these are important writings. And if we can approach them with, creatively and critically, there's a lot to be gained in them.
So good. It also makes you wonder how much of this tradition was actually part of ancient Israel all along. Maybe we don't have the writings to substantiate that or to prove it. But as you brought up Deuteronomy, I mean, if you're living in the 7th, 6th centuries and you still have quite an ancient tradition going all the way back. I'm doing research right now in the ancient Near East on the Apkallu. I mean, that tradition is amazing to think about as well from a Neo-Assyrian perspective, all the way back to the early Babylonian period. It's not easy to pick apart, and you could see maybe how the way they tell these stories just matters for the present, whatever that present moment may be. But that leads me to another question here. One of the most famous of these texts, First Enoch, right? So this is always the topic that comes up in a lot of my classes. Everyone wants to talk about First Enoch. So how would you describe what the Enochic tradition is and why it matters, especially from this perspective? Does Qumran or do these texts help us at all with regard to with regard to the Enochic tradition, I should say?
Enoch he's a famous guy in 2025. It seems like, there's for someone who has a very strange little bio in Genesis and now has kind of this literary afterlife in Pseudepigrapha, for example. There's a whole subculture around Enoch. It's very interesting, just even from like a pop culture perspective. Like, how is Enoch, trending? Anyways, what's going on with Enoch at Qumran? Getting back to one of these you said about these Aramaic texts, Enoch is written in Aramaic. We knew that, but we didn't have ancient copies like we do now at Qumran. We have many and multiple copies of Enoch at Qumran. And by that, I mean First Enoch. But this is before all of those booklets are brought together. So we have our earliest manuscripts of some of those booklets being brought together, but not all of them. Like I believe it's the Book of Parables. Sorry, I'll have to fact check my Aramaic scrolls on myself here. I believe it's the Book of Parables is not extant at Qumran, but all the other booklets of First Enoch are. So what does that say? Did it just did it deteriorate? Did they not like it? Was it not written yet? All of the above? Who knows, right? We don't fully know. So similar to those kind of my overview of the Aramaic scrolls, we have now Aramaic originals of many parts of that tradition that becomes First Enoch. We could also look at not just text, but context, like to kind of pull that thread further with us here. The ideas in Enoch about revelation, about the origins of evil, about the eventual resolution of the origins of evil, about calendar, those ideas seem to have really resonated with this Qumran community, where they seem to have been drawing upon or shaped their thinking in a lot of ways. So that text and context is really interesting. And kind of with both of those things, we have a number of new writings, or I should say new to us, right? We didn't know about them, I guess would be the better way to put it, that feature or associated with Enoch. Like the Book of Giants is a very interesting book. This has its whole own subculture these days. If you look up giant stuff, which is interesting. Book of Giants. It's kind of telling the story. This Genesis, 6, we have the flood, right? And Enoch is, somehow according to Enoch tradition, he walked with God. He has all these dream visions and these things. But then you have evil after the flood. Well, like, what happened? I thought this was the reset button, and what happens that, one of the answers is, well, the spirits of the giants kind of lived on, and this is kind of an answer to the explanations of evil. You get this in Enoch a little bit, and in Jubilees as well, I believe. The Book of Giants is kind of telling the giants side of the story. They have these apocalyptic dream visions, right? That they're getting the sense that things aren't going to be looming, or something's looming. It's not going to go well for them. They have this dream of these, trees and this forest flooding, and there's fire and, hellfire and brimstone. So they go and talk to Enoch, and they go, what is going on? And Enoch interprets this, and basically it's like, yeah, bad news, guys. This is not going to end well. What's interesting to me is that that's a different take on the Enochic tradition we're more familiar with. And Nathan, it sounds like you're in ancient Near Eastern stuff. You might have seen this already, but this is a great example where, like, one of the giants' names in the Book of Giants is Gilgamesh.
Right.
So these scribes are kind of making the jab that, you guys over there think you're the imperial superpowers. Well, your epic hero is actually quite literally a bastard from the flood, right? Like that's the punch that's being made here. We have a writing like that. I talked about Genesis Apocryphon already. Enoch, Abram rather, when he's going into Egypt, and Sarah is absconded into the harem of the Pharaoh, and he's worried about her and all these things. But one of the scenes in Genesis Apocryphon is Abram is reading from what's said to be a book of Enoch before the Egyptian nobles.
Yeah.
Well, what's going on there? I think what's going on there is it's, again, making a not so subtle jab. Like, okay, the Egyptians think they're so smart. They got all this stuff from Enoch. That's, and so to me, those are cultural conversations that are playing out in these texts. So when you think about Enoch at Qumran, I think it's many things. I think it's the actual Aramaic texts we have that we can look at now and study for the textual development. It's that contextual conversation around how this can inform or has informed Qumran identity. And then it's all this other stuff about those cultural conversations that are opened up. And maybe that's why Enoch is such a rock star. He's good at all these things, or that book opens up all these things. But if you haven't read Enoch, go read it, and then go read, Book of Giants and Genesis Apocryphon and these types of things. And you'll get closer to a complete picture, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's excellent. And two, I mean, you bring up the Book of the Giants. You have confirmation of that in Babylonian texts, where they think of Gilgamesh as 2/3 of Kalu, 1/3 human, right? So you have.
Yep.
So it's interesting, though, that you have this community still carrying on some of that tradition, maybe having come through the exile, that those traditions remain. And so very interesting to see how this time period is, as we've noted, I think, all throughout this podcast already, trying to figure out what's going on through interpretation, right? Yeah. I mean, and writing it down in this way that they can try to grasp the world around them. So that brings us to another scroll then that's really important within this community. What can we learn about the community of Qumran from the War Scroll?
Yep.
And its emphasis on ritual purity. I just did a class on Leviticus, so I realize, Mati's asked me before, what book would you have if you were on an island alone? What book of the Bible? And I always said, well, I'd have Leviticus, right? Because it would be me and the Lord. I'd need to know how to act if the Lord's around. Right? Something like
I like that. I was wondering, how is he going to explain this to the desert island pick?
Yeah, right.
I think you might have. I take back everything bad I've said about Leviticus, because I'm like, that makes sense.
And if humans show up, I got Leviticus 19 as well, and how to treat them. So I just figured
you've got your bases covered. All right, this has been already a very helpful podcast for me personally, because now I need to rethink all of the things I've said about Leviticus. But no, it's all joking aside. That's a great perspective. The War Scroll is part of that. The War Scroll is part of it in a way, right?
Yeah.
And ritual purity. So this is another text, and I've said this like 8 times. But I'll say it again. Like, Google the War Scroll. Part of the reason I keep saying that is when we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's important to read them in translation. But let's not forget, these are manuscripts. They're artifacts, and we live in an age of remarkable digital access to things. So even if you can't read Hebrew or Aramaic, Google the War Scroll, and you'll see some fantastic images. Beautiful manuscript. Even if you can't read it, I think appreciating these texts for what they are before we ask what they say is just part of the experience that they provide. Anyways, I digress. But the War Scroll and purity in Leviticus is really interesting. One of the things that I think is so important broadly about how we think about purity. And by we, I mean, I'm not coming at the scrolls. I'm coming at this from an expertise perspective, but I'm not coming at this from, a lived experience of Jewish tradition and culture. And things like halakha. So that was something I had to really sort of get my head around and wrap my mind around. And that's where a book like, if you want to read another scrolls book, Larry Schiffman's book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, a huge reminder about this. When you read the scrolls, we need to remember these are Jewish texts. And for many readers, myself included, that means trying to get my head into that ancient world in that context. So one of the buttons I push pretty hard in the book is that purity really, really mattered. It is not trivial in this context. And impurity did not equal sin. Those two dots, I think, in some interpretations, particularly Christian interpretations, maybe make that rushed conclusion. It's you become ritually impure for having a baby. Is it wrong to have a baby?
Yeah, exactly.
Have a menstrual cycle? No, this is, surprise, surprise, part of being human. And many things like this, like contacting the dead is just going to happen if you have a child, a sibling, a friend, a parent who's passed away, which will happen to every single one of us, right? So sin and impurity are not the same thing. How do we see this played out in Qumran? Many ways, but one of them in kind of the world of the War Scrolls, quite interesting. This is an apocalyptic type of text. It's written in Hebrew. It is, I think, projecting, we're used to kind of, Super Bowl showdowns or Stanley Cup showdowns, best of seven in hockey, right? This is a best of seven face-off between the forces of evil and the sons of light. And, God wins in the end. You always come out for the seventh game win, and he does in this text. But this is a war manual. It's for how this community was understanding that game, those 7-game series, 7-battle series to play out. And they were going to be battling as the sons of light and having angels in their midst. This is also part of their liturgical imagination. The Qumran community understood that somehow through their worship and lifestyle and liturgy, and in this case, their view of the eschaton, they would be commingling with angels. So then purity, if it mattered, now it really matters. So there's a number of things in the War Scroll, some which we probably might not like today, but this is part of their world about gender and disability. And these are the folks that would not be allowed to be in the camp because it's impure. Again, we don't have to agree with the interpretation. We probably shouldn't, but we can see what they're trying to do, perhaps. They also have other things. One that I speak about a little bit is a great example of where something seemingly basic and innocuous is actually quite instructive. If you're in a best of 7 end of time battle against the Sons of Darkness, you're going to need to use a restroom at some point, right? This is why every sports game has periods. You get a break in between. You go get a beer and you use a restroom or whatever. So where do you put the toilets? Where do you put the toilets if you're among angels? They have to be outside the camp. And the War Scroll goes to great lengths to say they have to be this many cubits outside of camp. And that's in and of itself an interpretation.
That is interesting, yeah.
But it all comes back to the idea that purity really mattered. The way they understood their liturgical world and eschatological world involved commingling with the angels. So purity really, really mattered. And then things that seem simple enough, like where are you going to use a restroom, is a major and important area for how it shapes your understanding and your identity. So War Scroll, again, a really cool read. A lot of other things going on in there, but those are a few of the things that come to mind when we think about War Scroll and purity. What do we do with that? That's a couple of things.
Yeah, very good, very good. And I mean, putting that back into its ancient context, very important, because you are showing that there is great interpretation going on to the texts that have been received when it comes to impurity and holiness in that matter. So,
and very thoughtfully done, right?
Very thoughtfully done.
Thoughtfully and creatively. Like I'm not coming up with a War Scroll when I go read purity texts. So this is really something.
Exactly. It really is. So, okay. So on that note, then I have a question here. Then how do the Dead Sea Scrolls impact the way we understand part of the historical and cultural context of Scripture, which we've talked about a lot? Now, you had a quote here at the beginning. I'm gonna use this from now on. An altar call for the historical critical method. That's great. I'm all for altar calls for the historical critical method. Maybe these days, but maybe tell us a bit about this. How do the Dead Sea Scrolls impact the way we understand that part of the historical cultural context
of
scripture.
Yeah, and we've kind of maybe we'll kind of put some of these threads together. We've been chatting throughout because this is a big part of how I think we probably can and should approach the scrolls, and we can learn a lot about this then to kind of extend beyond that into how we understand and approach the Bible. I said earlier, the Bible didn't fall from the sky. It has its own history. So let's dive into that. And part of that history, a big part of the history, is the cultures that helped shape it. When we look at the scrolls, I've said, these are texts and context. Another kind of pithy saying I keep in mind is the Dead Sea Scrolls are both before and beyond the Bible. And what I mean by that is they're coming before the time the Bible existed, right? This is before the canon. This is before even the technology of a codex. So the Bible, the book, literally could not have existed. But they also point beyond it in multiple directions. And one of the things we've talked about already is how do the scrolls point beyond themselves into the cultural context of the day of Second Temple period Judaism?
That's good.
That is... And I think every one of our questions gets at that in different ways we've been talking about. Okay, what about language? How do we understand Aramaic and Hebrew? What about pseudepigraphy? How do we understand scribes doing what they do? And what about Enoch? How do we understand traditions not being just about texts and more about, authoritative figures? Like, why is it that Moses keeps speaking? Why is it that David is somehow growing in authority? Like in the Psalm scroll, 11Q5, 11Q Psalms A. It says, late in the scroll that, here's a bunch of the Psalms. David wrote way more. He wrote 4,050. Wow. Like that scroll would be a mile long if that's what they're trying to say. But that's not what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is the Psalms are about more than a specific collection. It's about the authoritative voice of David. So when we think about historical and cultural context of Scripture, it means many things, probably many things that we were taught or you still teach, and it means things like understanding and diving into archaeology and sociology and manuscript studies. But I think with the scrolls, the things we're layering on here now is scribal culture, and Second Temple period identities, expectations, practices. We're talking about ritual. Those are all things that, again, I don't live in a world where 98% of those things are still operative. So when we go and study the scrolls, they're speaking to a lot of those things that are what shaped Scripture, the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, Christian New Testament, whatever the canon is that you're reading. Those are the things that are also at play in how it was shaped and formed. So I think historical critical method it kind of leaves a bad taste in some folks' mouth, but I think there's more to the story than it. And I think when we kind of pull it apart and we get at all those pieces of the puzzle, then the Dead Sea Scrolls really do kind of get at that before and beyond the Bible in different ways.
That's good.
Something you said makes me think of a question. Feel free to not answer this. I might just be a difficult one, but we think about scribal culture, right? Has been a big theme of our discussion today.
Yeah.
How big of a footprint would you say that scribal culture had on its own time beyond the culture, the place of the scribe? Like when we think about, even for example, in Qumran, right? We can think about, the caves. Okay, who's in the caves, or even beyond. So when we think about all these texts, right, which are so fascinating, and we can all read them today.
Yeah.
But I don't know, what did literacy rates look like? What cultural context would they have been read aloud? And do you have any guesstimate on how we can estimate the footprint, if you will, of the scribal culture in its own time, and who it would have impacted?
Surprise, surprise! You ask a scroll scholar about scribal culture, and I'm going to reference a book. So like that, But again, that book by Bill Schneedewind, that would be where I would go for this fantastic book. But some of the things I've been thinking about in light of his work is, we take for granted writing. This is not exactly what he's saying, but this is me kind of editorializing. We take for granted writing and literacy and ability to transmit and create traditions. But as soon as writing and the technology of writing seeped into many spheres of culture, not just a royal court, but things like receipts, right? Things like every other area, then all of a sudden, knowledge and scribal, there's a kind of an infrastructure for growth of scribal culture. It might be, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here, it might be roughly parallel to where we are with AI. right now. AI is
Mm-hmm.
still kind of newish,
Mm-hmm.
depending on where you're at and how do you use it and what is it and how do you use it well. It's not slowly, it's very quickly, but it will be embedded and integrated in almost everything we do and see, whether we know it or not. It will become ubiquitous. Maybe there's some rough parallel here that as writing became more, as scribal craft became more integrated into cultures and traditions, it was not only guilds, it was every other area in life had writing perhaps in some way informed in it or influenced in it. Maybe not to the same extent we're talking about AI, but I think it's wrong to think that at this period in time, there's a handful of scribes and nobody's reading. I don't think that actually makes sense. I think that this is a great example in the Dead Sea Scrolls of a community that's copying and collecting literature. They didn't write all the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think so.
Right.
So they came from elsewhere. Where else did they come from? Well, maybe the Jerusalem temple establishment, maybe other places. We have literary records at Elephantine. We have scribal traditions there as well, right? So this is, we haven't even talked about the other S word, the Septuagint, right? Like that's
right.
That's a whole other ball game, but one that we should probably be thinking about alongside of us. There's a lot more here than we realize. I'm not saying every household had their own scribe and they're creating stuff. That's not what's going on. It's not that embedded. But scribal communities and their connection to other types of guilds, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah.
That is helpful, like to imagine on a cultural level, instead of it just being, it's all these scribes just in a cave, super introverts by themselves.
Yeah.
And it's just no one else experiencing it, but kind of seeing this web, if you will, with different centers. Yeah, that's cool. Something I wanted to ask about is one of the biggest cultural themes that people think about when we talk about is the theme of the Messiah. And I'm curious, from your expertise, what would you say when you're looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically? Because obviously we can talk about the New Testament as well. But when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what do we see there about what these scrolls have to say about a messianic hope and expectation? What's there to learn from there? A
lot to learn from this. And it's a really exciting area of study. On the one hand, I think when we think of messianism, we're coming at it largely from our understanding of Christian messianism that's developed in and out of the New Testament. What the scrolls showed us, I think you get some of this even in the New Testament. Messianism was not the defining feature of Jewish groups at this period. When in the Gospels portray Jesus, wandering about and teaching and debating people, they're not debating messianism. They're debating things like purity, right? Like, so we need to kind of balance things out here, that even for Christianity, arguably messianism was not the big deal breaker, at least when we kind of read some things in the text. But when we looked at the scrolls, we see that there are a lot of things to say. There's a lot of things to say about messianism, but it's not really the dominant thing that defined their identity. Having said that, they have some really important elements in their views of messianism that looked quite different than what we expected. So what was different than we might have expected? They had multiple models for what the Messiah would look like and how they would, not physically, but what they would do. For example, in some community texts, we have this idea of like dual, like a tag team Messiah, Messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Well, hold on a second. That's totally different than what, if you're used to Christian messianism, that's not part of the deal. You have one Messiah, the Christ, not the Christs, plural. But here we have some views of in texts with the rule of congregation, if I'm not mistaken, about messiahs of Aaron and Israel. And that's very interesting. We have also other texts that are not only talking about, the roles of messiahs, but the signs of the times, like the messianic age. And this is in some writings an example or a way in which they were trying to articulate some of their, end of time expectations. What would the messianic age look like? And there's a writing, a Hebrew text called 4Q521. All the scrolls have these decode numbered names. I have something on my YouTube channel on this. It's not as scary as it sounds, but for lack of a better title, 4Q521. And this is a text that's interpreting the Psalms and Isaiah. So there we are back again to interpretation, right? They're pulling together parts of Psalms and Isaiah, and they're kind of mapping out what are the things that they're generally expecting for the Messianic age. And they're saying things like, well, the blind will receive the sight, the lame will walk, the lepers will be healed, the deaf will hear, there'll be good news, and the dead will be raised. Now, I don't know if that's ringing any bells, but that sounds a lot like Luke 7, I think Matthew, although my synoptics are a bit off these days. Luke 7, where John the Baptist, he's essentially on death row. He sends a runner to Jesus, and they say, like, are you the guy? And Jesus does what, the first century rabbi would do. He answers a question with a really great, non-direct question. And he goes, well, I'm not going to tell you, but if you've been paying attention, this is what you see. All the blind have their sight healed, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf have good news, the deaf can hear, there's good news preached, and the dead are raised. Now, let's go back to Isaiah and Psalms. That list of stuff you can more or less recover from Psalms and Isaiah and see how they're piecing together interpretation, except for that part about the dead being raised. That is not there in those passages. So where are they getting it from? Well, to bring it back to messianism, this is a view of the Messianic age, but arguably even more important than that, we talked about New Testament a little bit earlier on. They kind of touched on that, so we're kind of coming back to it. That writer, the writer of Luke, or this gospel tradition behind Luke, whatever the case may be, they're also part of that cultural conversation. They seem to be aware of that model of messianism that 4Q 521 is also aware of. Now, does that mean Luke borrowed from 4Q 521? No. Does it mean Jesus was in a scene? No. Those are not deep questions. The deeper question is, how are both of these writings now informed of that? There's that word again, context, and how are they part of it? And what are they getting out of it? And how are they tailoring it to their own setting and writing and community? So when it comes to messianism, there's a lot there. It's not the defining feature, but it provides some really interesting opportunities for us to rethink how messianism and ancient Judaism played a role in things like apocalyptic expectations, in scriptural interpretation, and to what degree some of those things are also part of the soil for Christian origins. So that's kind of, some things that come to mind, but this whole area is a really exciting read with some cool text in the scrolls.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much we can discuss, and your book has many more topics we didn't get to cover today. Again, highly recommend this book here, Lost Words, Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. So much to learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Obviously, there's stuff that now for us, we look at the Bible, there's Bible adjacent, other so many categories that we could try to impose on this wonderful diversity of literature. But I kind of want to end on more of a personal question.
Sure.
And again, feel free I can edit this out if you don't like to. But I ask it because for us, our ultimate goal with the podcast YouTube channel, Hear Bible Insights, making sense of the Old Testament for the church. I'm not sure what personal faith looks like for you, but for us as Christians trying to help with the Old Testament, I'd just be curious for you, is there any way that your research and your study of the Dead Sea Scrolls has impacted you personally in your own faith and in your own life?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to answer the question because I appreciate where it's coming from. And it's important to bring your whole self to things, right? So this is something that, the scrolls have been a part of my life journey for more than half of it now, which is kind of scary and weird at the same time. I'm at risk of becoming an Essene and I might not even know it. So it's kind of hard to say, well, here's professionally what they've done. I know what they've done for me professionally because it's really opened up a really exciting area that I've been able to kind of dig into for decades now. Personally, they've also done a lot of things. So when I think about what are the scrolls done for me on those areas, and they're not really separate. There's a lot of things that kind of connect across both of those. There's kind of two things I come back to that aren't necessarily in the scrolls, but they kind of push me into them or keep me in them, I should say. And these are two passages, one in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament and one in the New Testament. I'm not one for like put your favorite Bible verse in your fridge kind of thing, but if I was to make up some fridge magnets, this would probably be the two of them. The first is Proverbs 25:2. It says, it's the glory of God to conceal things, but it's the glory of kings to search them out. I think that's a really interesting mandate for research and thinking and an ethic of staying curious. That's the wisdom tradition is saying, like, stay curious, pay attention, read, think. And the scrolls have provided me a space to do that, to stay very curious, to be also very confused, frankly, and that's okay. That's also part of this journey. But to stay curious, to think and read and dialogue with people that think differently than you. I have made some incredible friends in this journey, academic friends that are far, smarter folks than I would have ever imagined to get to meet. We couldn't disagree more on many things, but it's so important, I think, particularly now in culture and society, to dialogue well. And the scrolls are an interesting place that have opened up for me personally to learn to do that. The other magnet on my fridge might be a bit shocking and weird, but in Mark 6:20, we were talking about John the Baptist a minute ago, right? And he's on death row. And in Mark's version of the story, it talks about, Herod's got some mixed feelings because he kind of likes John, but his wife's not so happy about him, right? And it says, in Mark 6:20, I think the latter half of the verse, if I'm not mistaken, when Herod heard John, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, yet he liked to listen to him. I think you pair that with Proverbs, and basically you've got, the license to not only, think, stay curious and pay attention, but to be okay with asking questions and to stay perplexed. It's kind of odd if someone was to say, like, who's your favorite character in the Bible? And I said, Herod. That wouldn't come off so well. But this part, I think there's something really interesting what Mark says there, and I think he's the only gospel tradition that says this. Again, my synoptics class is a bit foggy at this point, but stay curious and be okay with being perplexed and be open to listening to something, even if you're going, I don't know how that all adds up yet. That is part of the journey. So for me personally, professionally, those are two of the things, it's really hard for me to untangle those things in a lot of ways. But I think for this book, that's why I really framed it very much. It's not an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's an invitation to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
And it's an invitation to that journey. So if you're open to seeing some interesting stuff, being challenged a little bit, confirming some things that you also thought, that's also really important for the scrolls. We actually didn't get at that as much, but there's a huge part where the scrolls go, what? We had that stuff right. Isn't that awesome? But stay curious, be perplexed, have a little fun along the way. And whether or not you get every answer right away remains to be seen. But if we're thinking well and we're dialoguing and we're engaged, for me, that's been kind of why I've stayed in this and why I wanted to write the book, was to hopefully open that space up for others to do that as well.
Very good.
Well, I think anyone who's watching or listening to this, that's going to resonate, right? Why else would you click on a YouTube video with the Dead Sea Scrolls if you don't want to learn?
Yeah.
Right. And giving just a call to that. But the bigger challenge, what you mentioned, is being open to perplexity, because learning doesn't look like clarity, super clarity.
Yep.
Right. It's actually being open. And so often one of the things I see when people are trying to write like a thesis or a big paper is, too often, in my opinion, people start with a thesis statement. That's where they begin. Before I research, here's my statement. Now let me go prove it.
Yeah.
Instead of a thesis question, and like a real one, not like, of course we're human. In the back of our mind, we're going to have something we maybe think is the answer. Yeah. Okay. But like, are we willing to genuinely table what I think the answer might be and just dive in?
Yeah.
And also be willing to say, I remember one of my master's thesis papers, my wife was so bothered by this when I was working on this paper. It bothered me so long and I couldn't reach a conclusion, right? Yeah. And my question, in other words, was not answered. Yeah. Right? I had all this information, all this research, but it was still good. I didn't leave like, oh, I hate everything. Yeah, it was annoying, but in a way I feel like, I feel like I'm able to dive more into the nuances of this topic in this context. And that's okay, because life isn't all about having the clearest answers to everything in life.
Yeah.
We got to be comfortable with that if we want to learn, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a great example. I'm just amazed your wife actually listened to your research or read your paper. That was the outcome I think you were actually after, was getting someone else to suffer with you maybe. But that's a great example. All joking aside, growing and understanding is not only an outcome, a valid outcome, it's an incredibly invaluable outcome.
That's good.
And your point about method, I think, is really great. One of my own, we always these nuggets from our own, masters and dissertation supervisors. I remember at one point, one of my My dissertation supervisor, Dan Mishila, who's at Notre Dame now, I was wrangling what you were trying to wrangle, it sounds like, and going, here's what I think I'm going to argue in this, and here's the method and approach. And I was thinking about it, which was good. Mm-hmm. But I remember him saying, like, yeah, but it's kind of like if you're going to make star-shaped cookies and you have a star-shaped cookie cutter, guess what you're going to get? Star-shaped cookies, right? Like you're, and so method matters, but you need to kind of lean in and lead in with curiosity and building understanding. And then all that stuff can be really powerful.
It's good.
Well, as we close then, is there anything else you want to share with our audience, whether about Dead Sea Scrolls, anything you wish we had asked you, just anything comes to mind you'd like to share?
Not too much. I'll make a few last other references, not just trying to point people away from my book, but I'm very much, as maybe you can tell, you can contextualize your experiences with this book in some really important ways. Digital images, when I have a chance to in teaching or in whatever context, I use facsimiles, I use digital images. Like, even if you can't get on a plane and go to the museum, Israel Antiquities Authority and Shrine of the Book in Israel, you can go online on your phone, your tablet, your computer, look up the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Library. You don't have to understand the language to get lost in there and have a great time. So as you're reading about the scrolls, go look at some scrolls. One thing that my book doesn't do, because it's not meant to give you translations of all the scrolls, is provide you primary texts for everything. So if you wanted to learn more about, the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and the Hebrew Scriptures at Qumran, look up the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible by Flint, Abegg, and Ulrich. Really great book, and it will give you translations and introductions to all the biblical scrolls. Fantastic. And then you could pair that with another volume by Abegg, Wise, Abegg, and Cook, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Translation. So with those two, some digital images in my book, you have pretty much everything you would need to dive into the scrolls, see the scrolls, try to understand the scrolls, read translations, for if you're inviting or taking this invitation to the world of the scrolls, everything you need to be pretty much right there. So those would be my only recommendations is add to the choir and get some more reading on the shelf there.
Well, that's helpful. Look, because as you know, it's a huge world. So it's nice to get a recommendation from a scholar. Hey, here's where I'd start.
Yeah.
We'll put links to everything he just said in the show's description below. Great. Well, thank you for your generosity with your time. It's been great getting to learn from you. Dr. French and I, Nathan, we both really enjoyed reading your book. I definitely recommend Wonderful Invitation, Dead Sea Scrolls. Very engaging, very interesting, and also just engagingly told, right? It's just fun. It's a fun read. Very good with words. So thank you so much. And before we go then, if anyone wants to, obviously we'll have your book in the show notes. So if anyone wants to connect more with your content, study from you, or other projects you're working on, any ways for people to connect with your content or you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with social media, you got to pick a platform. At least that's my approach. So I'm on YouTube.
Excellent.
Probably more than I should be. So you can find me over on YouTube, youtube.com/Dr. Andrew Perrin. There are about 1,900 other Andrew Perrins, so I had to put doctor on front of there, not to be arrogant, but because I needed a short name. But you can find me over there. So I think we occupy a similar space. That if you find the type of things that you like on this podcast, and thanks for having me on your platform, you guys are incredible, by the way. You might find some things interesting over there. So please do look me up. And if you can't find me there, my website is andrewperrin.com, and you can find links to things like that on there.
Excellent.
Great. We'll link that below as well. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Andrew Perrin, for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks for everything you're doing on the channel and for having me.